Catherine Jaffe from Texas State University, who will be talking to us today about circulating gender and race in two early American Quixotic novels.
Okay, with this? With this one? Okay. 1801. The novel Female Quixotism, exhibited in the romantic opinions and extravagant adventures of Dorcasina Sheldon, is published anonymously in Boston, little over a decade after the signing of the American Constitution. Its author, Tabitha Tenney, had accompanied her husband, a physician and Revolutionary War veteran, the previous year to Washington, D.C., where Tenney served 3 terms as a Federalist congressman representing the state of New Hampshire. Dr. Tenney, and perhaps his wife, opposed the election of Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, and Congressman Tenney voted for the continuation of the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act, which in the royally wake of the French Revolution suppressed political dissent during the Federalist era, facilitating the deportation of foreigners and making it harder for immigrants to vote. Tenney, like his wife, was a committed abolitionist. Female Quixotism went through 5 editions through 1841. 1818. The first volume of La Quixotita y su prima, Little Miss Quixote and her cousin, begins to circulate in Mexico in installments. Its author was José Joaquín Fernández de Lizardi, a Creole writer who had been publishing satirical pamphlets in New Spain since 1811, in the wake of the 1808 abdication of King Carlos IV of Spain, the overthrow of the Spanish viceroy of New Spain by peninsular-born Spaniards, and the 1810 Hidalgo uprising by the American-born Spaniards that ended with Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821. When freedom of the press was established with the promulgation of the Spanish Constitution of 1812, Lizardi founded his first newspaper, El Pensador Mexicano, the Mexican Thinker. When strict censorship was imposed following Fernando VII's return to the throne in 1814, Lizardi abandoned journalism for fiction. In 1816, he published Latin America's first novel, El Periquillo Sarmiento, The Mangy Parrot, followed by the first 2 volumes of La Quixotita in 1818 and 1819. Press freedom was restored in 1820 and Mexican independence declared in 1821, and Lizardi again took up journalism. The final 2 volumes of La Quixotita were published posthumously in 1831 and were circulating by 1832. The novel went through several editions throughout the 19th century. Lizardi was also an abolitionist. Both Quixotic novels, therefore, were published during periods of revolt, consolidation, and reaction during the first 2 decades of the 19th century, when newly established republics were being founded on the racialized categories of colonial societies. Whiteness was never a fixed, absolute category, but was under constant development, as European, African, indigenous, and Asian cultures mixed in the evolving new societies. Gender was often discursively aligned with racial categories, and it encoded tensions regarding hierarchy, status, subordination, property, freedom and enslavement, civilization, and savagery, according to Deirdre Coleman. In New Spain, racial difference and mixing, the process of whitening and darkening, was codified in the complex casta system of the colonial period. Tenney's and Lizardi's female Quixotic protagonists' circulation through the reality of their racialized societies reveals the tensions experienced as the national subject was being constructed. Historian Carol Smith Rosenberg, referring to Bakhtin's analysis of dialogical discourse and heteroglossia in the novel, reminds us that, quote, language assumes meaning only in social dialogue, end quote. The violent contestation of national identities formed by inclusions and exclusions that Smith-Rosenberg discusses in early US discourses are also evident in Mexico. While virtue, both in the civic humanist tradition and in commercial Republican values of hard work and thrift, were always masculine, seductive corruption, lack of control, and aristocratic non-productivity were gendered as feminine. Aristocratic and middle-class male writers and speakers displaced onto women the criticism of extravagance or deception or seduction or duplicity that had first been directed at them, at themselves. The feminine, concludes Smith-Rosenberg, quote, came to represent not only the negative, but the most controversial and contested points in these male discursive battles. Polymorphic and conflicted, female subjectivity was formed at the heart of ideological and discursive conflict and contradiction, end quote. Scenes from the two novels show how gender constructions intermix with class and racial descriptions. In Female Quixotism, the aging protagonist, Dorcasina, gray-haired, sallow, and toothless after an illness, has imagined that her handsome young servant John is a gentleman in disguise and is in love with her. She goes out riding with him, having shaved her hair off and donned a fashionable wig from Philadelphia. Quote, she had at the same time purchased a small hat with two enormous high feathers. Having dressed herself in the new riding dress, this hat, this wig, and these feathers, she mounted a mettlesome horse and cantered off with John by her side, with the air and spirit of a girl of 18, unquote. Unfortunately, her horse gets skittish and bolts. Dorcasina hangs on, but loses her hat, feathers, and wig. John retrieves the hat, but a pig picks up the wig with its snout. The spectacle of Dorcasina's wild ride home amazes her neighbors, as does the advertisement she asks John to write to beg for the return of her wig. Since John is illiterate, another servant helps him write this announcement. Know all men buy these presents, whereas Miss Dorcasina Sheldon will give $5 to anybody that will find her wig. She lost it last Thursday, ridden a horseback. P.S. Said wig was frizzled all over, afore and behind, like Negger's owl, end quote. Not only does Dorcasina dangerously try to mix classes, but the aging, ridiculous Quixote exhibits decadent pride associated with city fashion, and she's described with racial characteristics by the ignorant low-class servants. In Lizardi's novel, the Quixotita Pomposa was raised to be extravagant and vain by her parents, who neglected her education and entrusted her to indigenous servants. Her cousin, Prudenciana, was in contrast carefully educated in virtuous domesticity and filial obedience by her father, the colonel. One day, the two families ride from Mexico City on horseback to attend the country wedding of the son of the peasant Pascual, foreman of the colonel's ranch. Prudenciana and her mother wear riding habits that allow them to sit astride without a side saddle, while Pomposa uses a type of riding seat, un famoso sillón. The vain Pomposa is jealous of the praise heaped on her cousin for the practicality of her outfit that allows her to dismount easily and then fastens with buttons to become a skirt. Such a riding habit, they say, is used all over in Europe and even in Mexico by some foreigners and Spaniards. Pomposa, distracted by her envy, manages to drop her parasol over her horse's ears, causing it to get skittish and bolt. The girl is thrown to the ground, quote, in such an indecent posture that no one could doubt the color of her garters, end quote. In these two riding scenes, both Quixotes are publicly humiliated for their ridiculous vanity and adoption of city fashion. The clothing motif arises again in the moments after the country wedding, or before the country wedding, when Pomposa and her mother try to give the peasant bride an elegant tunica, mantilla, and fan to use during the ceremony. The bride rejects them because they would look ridiculous for someone of her class. Quote, "Oh no, senora, with your permission, I will not put those dark clothes on. Those are for ladies like you, but not for me, a poor country girl, una provecaya," end quote. The peasant bride will go to the church in her typical Mexican shawl, rebozo, and the colonel praises her behavior as, quote, "a lesson in conformity," end quote, with class expectations. Lizardi thus carefully draws the lines between affected American-born middle to upper-class Creoles and the rustic mestizos of the countryside closer to the indigenous culture. Both the negative values of European culture, pride and extravagance, are cast onto the feminine through Pomposa's clothes and her behavior. But her cousin benefits from learning practical and modern customs from Europe, while rejecting luxury and accepting her place in colonial society. The most intriguing example of the complex way in which Lizardi embodies the construction of national identity through race, class, and gender appears in the very first chapter of his novel. Pascual, the ranch foreman, bursts into the colonel's house in town, holding two small dogs in his hands. Quote, "At that moment, the bell on the stair rang. The door opened, and a payo peasant with his embroidered sleeves, sun cape on his shoulders, and his riding boots, rushed in, making a great noise, dragging his spurs, and carrying two little dogs in his hands, followed by an old woman. He shouted without taking off his enormous hat, 'Hail Mary, master, these are dirty tricks, perradas, that Christians can't put up with. I don't know why the whole city isn't destroyed by lightning,' end quote. Pascual tells the colonel that he entered another elegant city house on an errand and found a fine lady nursing two little dogs to relieve the pressure in her breasts, while her newborn son cried at her feet, unfed since the Indian wet nurse, La Chichi, left. Pascual's righteous indignation at this unnatural neglect by the baby's mother aligns inherent virtue and human decency with manly attributes of the lower mixed race class, while the selfish neglect of motherly duties is cast onto the feminized upper class American-born European. This scene was featured in an engraving in the second edition of the novel in 1842 here, and again in succeeding editions. The racial characteristics of the mestizo peasant were increasingly exaggerated throughout the 19th century editions, evidence of the power of Lizardi's early formulation of gender roles and Creole Mexican identity. Lizardi was a member of the Creole lettered class, who were in the historical process of losing their identity as Spanish subjects and constructing a new national identity. El Pensador Mexicano tried to claim the decency and manly virtues of the mixed-race peasant class while displacing onto the feminine the negative aspects of their own European heritage in the complex society of late viceregal and early independence era Mexico. Carol Smith Rosenberg has theorized that as England's colonies were attempting to construct a new identity separate from that of their British forebears, from whom they nevertheless proudly inherited their cultural legacy, they went through a process of introjection, the term that Freud used to describe the infant's passionate, possessive, and even sadistic desire for the mother's breast. European Americans, quote, "desire to incorporate the superabundance, the plenitude, the power of the continent, coexisting with a nationalistic need to differentiate themselves from Europe, possess the emotional excessiveness, the insatiability introjection captures," end quote. Smith-Rosenberg's analysis is a suggestive way to interpret the primal scene that begins Lizardi's novel. The writer clearly projects onto the masculine the simple, natural virtue of the mixed-race lower-class payo, but also intensively identifies with the pain and powerless rage of the infant son abandoned by its selfish European-American mother, who embodies all the negative qualities of European Spanish culture the new Criollo class was wanting to shed. Tenny's female Quixotic comes to her senses at last and rejects a French-influenced, libertine, Jacobite scoundrel interested only in her money and property. Tenny's novel, observes Linda Frost, quote, embodies a catalog of class anxieties that particularly disturb the Federalist constituency of the new republic, anxieties about who would in fact inherit the power of rule in the new country, end quote. Lizardi's Quixotita embodies the class and racial anxieties of Mexico's independence period by becoming a true public woman, a prostitute, and ultimately dying of syphilis, sustained only by a desperately poor but kind-hearted mestiza woman. Lizardi encodes how women were excluded as political subjects as he closes the final volume of the novel with this advice to women, quote, in the business of the family and not in that of the state is where a woman should show her talent and prudence, end quote. Tenny's and Lizardi's female Quixotic novels make a compelling case for how the circulation of conceptions of gender, race, and class contributed to the construction of national identities in the early American neighboring republics of the United